Love staying informed? Subscribe now and get unlimited access to local news, weather, and sports for just 99 cents a month for your first 3 months at inforum.news/join. Read every story, listen to every podcast, and download the apps that keep you informed and on the go 24 hours a day. So head to inforum.news/join right now to subscribe. What are you waiting for? Get 3 months of local news for just 99 cents a month at inforum.news/join.
Welcome to Plain Talk. So during the last legislative session earlier this year. It seems like so long ago, but it really wasn't. It was just weeks ago that our lawmakers were in Bismarck doing their jobs. A part of that session, one of the storylines that I followed pretty closely was some dissatisfaction with the job that State Auditor Josh Gallion is doing. Now, if you don't know, in North Dakota, the auditor is a independently elected office, and the current office holder is Josh Gallion. He's a Republican. And there's been some complaints on a number of fronts that the costs of audits have gone up significantly under his leadership, which is to say that the cost that his office charges, for instance, local government. So that would be like a county commission or even one of the storylines was an ambulance service out in Killdeer who got audited. So the costs are going way up. There's also been a feeling that Gallion likes to sensationalize the findings of his audits in some dramatic testimony before a legislative committee. Members of the Gwinner Fire District, which is a volunteer fire department, came and played audio of Gallion on a talk radio show where he was making some claims that were not in keeping with the findings of his own audit. So there's been a lot of complaints. The legislature responded to that by doing a couple of things. They put in place some new reporting requirements for the auditor, where he has to come to a legislative committee and make regular reports about his job performance. Also, the legislature appropriated $500,000 for a performance audit of the auditor. The auditor is getting audited. And now the new chair of the committee that oversees these things, colloquially, it's called LAFRC. It stands for Legislative Audit and Fiscal Review Committee. The new chair of that committee is Representative Emily O'Brien. She's a Republican from Grand Forks. Republican from Grand Forks. I don't know why I thought I messed that up. In my head for a minute, I thought I screwed up. But no, I said it right. She's the new chair. She was also a critic of Gallion's, and now she's going to be overseeing some of these new accountability measures for his office. Emily, welcome to the program. Of course, we're also joined by my co-host, Ben Henson. Emily, how you doing?
Good. Thank you for having me. Excited to be here.
So tell me, first of all, where we're at in terms of, you're the new chair of the LAFRC committee. You're going to be overseeing some of these things for the auditor. Talk about what, in your mind, is obviously the whole committee is going to weigh in, but what in your mind is the right approach to this?
Well, so I'm going to even back up a little bit further in how we got here. So I, last interim session, was appointed as the vice chair of LAFRC. And so I had a couple of agencies that had reached out and expressed concerns, but didn't want to publicly come out with their concerns of what was happening. And so I dug in and just started doing random samplings of reaching out to political subdivisions, different agencies, the process, how the audits work, how the financing of things go, like what funds does it come from to pay for these audits, to really get an understanding. And there was a repetitive pattern of, there was frustration that the audit bills were doubling and tripling. Some of them increased by over 212%. And so that was eye-opening for me. And it wasn't, you hear conversations or people posting on social media or whatever, that this was a personal attack. This is not a personal attack. This is about checks and balances. And that's what the legislature does for any state agency.
Well, at one point during the session, Auditor Gallion he wrote a press release that came from his office. His office communications person sent this out to the news media, accusing making broad accusations of corruption and backroom deals. He's walked back from that somewhat. He's expressed to me that he regretted sending it. He's also tried to claim that he wasn't talking about all lawmakers. People can go look up and read his statement for themselves, but that was part of the reaction where he was characterizing this as a political or a personal attack on him, and you're saying, no, it was rooted in what I was hearing from a lot of the people who get audited by Gallion.
Correct. And we had the state auditor and team in front of us in the legislature and had the opportunity, to address the letter and didn't want to have that conversation, which is fine. There's no hard feelings on my end. It's, trying to move forward and doing what's best for the people and that pay for these audits, which are the taxpayers. No matter if it's a political subdivision, ambulance district, the taxpayers are paying for them, or a state agency.
And I think someone outside of this process, Representative O'Brien, would they're kind of scratching their head wondering, because if they don't, frankly, if it comes down to knowing Josh Gallion, they're kind of wondering who's watching the watchman. Is there precedent for the legislature to specifically oversee? Because essentially what it sounds like to maybe the layperson is that you're auditing the auditor. And is that standard practice? Is it new? And then what triggered your investigation into these things where you started finding these patterns?
So yes, it has been in Century Code that it is up to the discretion of the legislature to do an audit on the auditor's office. And again, we're the checks and balances for all these state agencies. It's not just the auditor's office. And there's been audits done on Water Commission, the Dickinson State University. This isn't anything that's unique. And like I had mentioned previously, it was agencies that had, expressed their concerns to me. And then when it wasn't just two of them and it ended up being, or not just one of them, but it ended up being three of them. And then when I started digging in and then literally doing a random sampling, I just, I dove in, I said, okay, I'm going to figure out how this process works, who gets audited, because I didn't want almost any biased information. I wanted to be able to get an understanding for myself, ask those questions, and then hear the stories. And so that's just kind of how I dove in. And then more and more people started reaching out to me saying, hey, this is our story. This is our situation. What do we do? We're afraid because of retaliation. If we speak out, we're in the middle of an audit right now. How do we approach this?
Do you have any idea why someone else wasn't doing this before you were doing it? Because you kind of just, you answered in part why the entities that were being audited maybe didn't speak up because they didn't want to ruffle feathers while they were under audit. But I think that's what you're describing is maybe the opposite of the impression of North Dakota state government, that's a small town with a lot of long roads in between. It seems like this was going on for a bit. Do you know why there wasn't something or someone in place to oversee this, or for them to report to or make a complaint to previously?
Well, so there is. That's what LAFRC is. That's the oversight. And I guess I was not necessarily naive, but I've served on industry, business, and labor and transportation committees my previous sessions. And so I would say this was more on the appropriation side of things that we're seeing this in. Since 2017, I believe there had been several conversations, several bills that had been introduced each session to continue to streamline and, really tighten up or focus the directives for the state auditor's office. And I think, the way that it was portrayed initially when I had first introduced my bill was like, oh, another session, another attack on the auditor's office. And that
was a direct quote from an op-ed you put in the paper for everyone to read.
Yeah, and that is so far from the truth because I didn't realize that there had been conversations from previous sessions to address that. And so it was more so realizing after the fact that there had been several attempts to address certain concerns and situations, it was like, okay, we really need to nail this down because we keep having the same conversations, but nothing is changing. And so how do we ensure that, all sides are working together to get the outcomes that we're looking for?
Well, one of the complicating factors here is auditors, I would add, maybe much like journalists, a lot of times get criticism that's not motivated by any actual deficiencies in the job that they're doing, but just that people don't like having certain things exposed. The auditor's got a tough job. I don't think everybody agrees on that, where sometimes you have to go out there and you have to identify problems. I mean, when the auditor does a good job, a lot of times it exposes real problems that are hard for people to accept, or they don't want to accept them, what have you. How did you weed what was going on? Because I agree with you, and I've talked to a number of these people, and I think when you look at the increasing costs, I'm still scratching my head about why these audits are so much more expensive. When I hear, situations where, the auditor's office was talking to different people and spreading information, about audits that that happened in Killdeer, where, the auditor's office was what I would describe as leaking information out that ended up having an impact on an election for a mill levy increase for the ambulance service, where it ended up getting defeated, and some of it had to do with information that leaked from an incomplete audit. I mean, these are real problems. But how did you make sure that it wasn't just sour grapes, where the people that the auditor's office is supposed to hold accountable just didn't want to be hold accountable, so they're attacking the auditor? That's got to be a fine line to walk.
Well, and so being in business, we do insurance audits. And so I had no problem. I understand where both sides are coming from, because I've gone through audits before, and it's like, okay, you want to make sure that you're doing the best policies and practices possible to avoid any sort of hiccups or negative outcomes in the end. And so I think people were, you know what you know, and you don't know what you don't know. And so people were eager to make sure that they were doing the right processes. I think the main issue and concern was that people felt like they were trying to do the right thing, and if they were doing the wrong thing, they didn't know that they were doing the wrong thing, but then were dragged through the mud in the media, painting a picture that there was criminal activity going on, and that couldn't be further from the truth. And so I think people felt like they were being attacked, but didn't have an opportunity to even defend themselves, that they were trying to do the right thing. They were in good faith of doing what people expected of them, and again, couldn't defend themselves. And their opportunity to defend themselves is through reporting to the Legislative Audit and Fiscal Review Committee, or when a bill gets introduced, to tell their story.
And, and for the average person, maybe government entities, it's a little different, but I don't know if they know that kind of complexity, that nuance. And Representative Brian, how are you? Has the committee had any meetings since the legislative session? Is it on the docket right now? How can a member of the public kind of read or see or interact with these meetings that you're having here in the interim?
So we just got done 2 weeks ago, I think it was. Time has been kind of flying by this summer already. 2 weeks ago, legislative management, we put all of our legislators to their respective committee assignments. And so we are looking at scheduling the next LAFRC meeting around the first or second week in August. And so it's just a matter of coordinating schedules, and I'm working with council. And so that's when that first Legislative Audit and Fiscal Review Committee will be. And then we'll already have a slate of what audits we'll be going through. And then I've had a couple other entities reach out that want to present. And so we'll give them an opportunity to come in, present, and tell their stories as well.
What I want to talk a little bit about the new expectations that the last legislature put in place for the auditor's office. So first is the new reporting requirements, where is it quarterly? I think that the auditor has to come in and report to the committee on certain things. What are as the chair of that committee, what are your expectations of those reports?
I mean, exactly how we laid them out. And yes, it is quarterly. And so, because LAFRC meets quarterly by code. And so, to ensure that those requirements are happening, one of the biggest things that we saw was the units that were being charged per pricing. People want an itemized breakdown of what they're being billed, and rightfully so. They deserve to have that information of, how many hours are going into these audits, what are they, looking into. Some entities felt like they were providing documents 2 or 3 times and then also being billed for the second and third time that they were providing those documents. And so, being transparent and holding each other to the same standards that, he's requiring of doing those audits, I think that's the most appropriate way to move forward.
Have you had any one-on-one conversations with the state auditor, either during the session or after, about kind of expectations or goals for the committee leading into the next legislative session in these audits?
We were supposed to have one on Monday, but I had to cancel because I had another meeting go long. But we are going to be having one here after the 4th of July.
That makes sense. When you'd mentioned before, I just wanted to follow up. You mentioned about something to the tune of 216 or somewhere around there increases in costs in audits year to year as you were doing random sampling. Can you, for further context, let us know what were some of the dollar figures there? And I ask that because sometimes when we throw numbers around in the legislature, they'll be like, this building permit got increased by 200%. And then you find out it was a small construction building permit that went from $25 to $50. I'm guessing that's not the case here, but can you give listeners a little bit more context into those?
Yeah. So, and I just threw the 212% number out because that's one that just stuck to my head. But some audit fees only had a 5% increase and some of them went up to 212. And so one that I can think of off the top of my head was a state agency, even as of recently 3 weeks ago, went from $142,000 audit fee to $198,000 audit fee. And so that is significant increase. And when the programs haven't changed, why would there be an increase in the audit fees? And so it's something that we're going to dig into and find out.
And to be clear, ultimately, all of those audit fees are paid by the taxpayers. That's where the money's coming from. And a lot of times, some of the fees, if you're talking about an ambulance service or a rural fire department, a 25% or 30% or whatever the percentage ends up to be increase in their audit costs, that is a major hit that they have to figure out how to accommodate. Let's talk about the performance audit for the auditor's office for a minute.
Rob, one second,
sorry, go ahead.
Just to for budgeting purposes. A lot of these state agencies, we just got done with a legislative session for biennium. That's 2 years. They have to budget for those audits and how much they're going to cost. And if those audit fees are over what they were from the previous year, the year before that, they then have to figure out and scramble, okay, where do we cut that was already approved by the legislature or by our local school board or city council or county board? How are we going to scramble and figure out how to pay these bills? Yeah. And so that's a big piece.
And with the local entities, you already have factors such as just basic snowfall. When you're talking about county budgets or firefighter budgets, you don't know how much of those services they're going to use, and to have a unsteady audit fee on top of that, I'd be pulling my hair out if I were on one of those local boards, because almost $200,000 is a big dent.
And some of them are anywhere from I think Grand Forks went from because Grand Forks County was one that I dabbled into, and I reached out to our local county auditor, and I believe it went from $19,000 to $22,000 to $42,000, around those numbers. And so trying to figure out the justification for those dollars. It was said that it was because of COVID dollars that were received, but still I'm not sure that it would result in a doubling.
And I get, but you're looking at an audit that's the cost of an entire FTE for most of these places. That just
yeah.
So it's really, and one of the things I noticed too when I wrote about this is I some of the records I got back, the communications from the auditor's office when they would send an invoice for the audit, there wasn't a lot of information on it. It just, I'm forgetting what the line item, there was one line item said you got, something like you got audited, and then a dollar figure, and that was it. Not there was there's no real explanation. And there's still a lot of people who are bewildered, and I'm not sure, I've asked the auditor about this, and he's talked about, how thorough they are and things like that. But there's no specific like, well, this agency that we audited had, they had 15 new people doing 3 new programs, and so the scope of the audit expanded. That understandable answered is not there. I haven't heard it, but I do want to talk before we end about the performance audit. And I mean, where is that? Who's going to perform the audit? Is it in the works yet? When do you expect it to be completed?
So that is directed from legislative management, the chair. So that's Chair LaFour. But then the way that I understand is that an RFP will be issued. So it'll be a third-party audit that's done, and private entities will respond, and they'll go through the RFP process, and I would assume have specific directives of, hey, this is what we're looking at auditing, and then go forward from there. And so I'm not sure who the audit will be reported to, but that's kind of the process. And I think that they want to just get the ball rolling because there's so many studies and things that are in the works. So just getting things moving and shaking. But once the RFP is issued, it will go from there.
Do you feel like there's one thing that we talked about was fear of blowback from the auditor's office, and the audit? I mean, really, they can swing a big stick in terms of public relations, and by that I mean if the auditor's office sends out and they say, oh, we had all these findings for a school district or something. I mean, a lot of times, I hate to say it, but the public's not going to go and read the audit. And if you have an auditor who is prone to sensationalizing, they can do a lot of damage. And I know that was one thing when I was reporting on this, is I had a lot of people who did not want to talk on the record because they were scared that I don't want to be dragged through the mud by this auditor. And it wasn't just, I wrote about, the Gwinner Fire District and the Killdeer Ambulance Service, but we had a previous situation where this auditor and a former Commerce Commissioner, Michelle Comer, where she really felt that the auditor made some accusations of criminal activity that turned out not to be the case. But she, her and some of her staff had
personal legal fees.
Right. They so now you have state officials who are being audited by the state auditor who made accusations of criminal misconduct or suggested that there may have been criminal misconduct, and then had to pay for lawyers out of their own pockets to try to defend themselves. I mean, I don't know. I think one very interesting part of all this is just fear of retaliation. Like everybody's been kind of afraid to talk about, and maybe that's to Ben's point. Why didn't this come up earlier? I think there was a fear here. Nobody wants to take on the auditor.
Go ahead, Ben.
Well, Representative O'Brien, if that were to happen again in a similar situation to either another elected official or to one of these smaller, like Rob was referencing, rural fire department, rural school district, something like that, and you were to be made aware of it, what would the end result be? Because I'm trying to think of it from the perspective of an outsider just looking at their government going to work, an auditor auditing and you as a representative overseeing that. If they're not happy with that, which I would kind of assume someone getting into all the weeds wouldn't be, and they've seen Josh Gallion, frankly, set that precedent, and he does it, let's say he does again, I hesitate to say under your watch because he doesn't work for you, but you are overseeing him. What are the repercussions, or what actions can be taken? Because so far, frankly, there's not much outside of now he's going to have to report them. And what I don't like about my question is it sounds like I'm trying to set you up to be a finger wagger or like a punisher of some sort. And I know that's not what you're trying to do, nor is it the purpose of it. But if you're a member of the public, you got to wonder, well, okay, what's happened? What's preventing him from doing this again in the future? Now we have this distinct pattern.
Well, and I think that's the beautiful process of our democracy is you get to go vote. If you don't like what he's doing or how he's running the office as a state auditor, that's how that process works. And same for me. If I'm not doing what people are expecting of me, they can go and vote me out or run someone against me. And that's the best part about our process. But I think my end goal is, I went from 3 different entities reaching out to me to over 60 different entities reaching out of, hey, this was our story, and trying to figure out how do we proceed and move forward. And I'm hoping that's what we can do during this interim, and then it may result in legislation. But how do you legislate behavior? That's something that I struggle with.
60 entities, were those all public taxpayer funded entities, or were some of those private?
Everything is public that goes through the state auditor's office.
No.
Private entity.
Sorry. Got it. So it was all publicly funded. And are those 60 entities, have they been named as reaching out to you, or are there confidentiality there, or?
I have told people that I'm more than happy to be confidential, just because they were either in the middle of audits, or they had just finalized, or they're up for an audit coming up. And so keeping them, confidential, and just trying to help them navigate the process to the best of my ability.
And that's, I think a final point that's important here is sometimes, to your point, Emily, I think sometimes when we see a problem in an office, the reaction is almost consequences that are more for the office. And so, I've always wanted to be very careful. I like that we have an independent auditor who has a lot of latitude. I like that the auditor is accountable directly to the voters, and I like that they have a lot of latitude to hold state government accountable and to root out problems and hopefully put us on a track to solve those problems. And so I've always wanted to be careful when we're dealing with a situation like this, that just because you may have somebody in the office who is not using the powers of that office appropriately, that's not necessarily an argument for changing the powers of the office. That's an argument, that's a personnel problem. Does that make sense what I'm saying?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I encourage audits. I encourage, making sure that we are doing things properly, that we are doing things accurately, because I think that's what, I guess I'm a type A OCD person. I want to make sure we're doing right and properly, and that we're in compliance with the laws. And I mean, not only state laws, but federal laws. We have, a lot of different programs and services that we offer, and taxpayer dollars that need to be held accountable. And we have workforce shortage problem. I mean, there's entities that are struggling to find the appropriate people to run and do these accounting practices, and whether it's a school board or a school district or a county, wherever. And so, doing those checks and balances is so important. But when it becomes zealous and stretched, if you will, that's when I think, it's not productive anymore. It's a gotcha kind of mentality, and that's where people are struggling.
Well, I think your point about, we got to wrap this up, but your point about workforce, I think, is well made, because just about every agency in state government is struggling to hire, struggling to retain, and I don't blame those workers. The workers are going to do, but it's a harder pitch when you watch state employees get raked over the coals by their own auditor, get maybe accused of crime. We had the state librarian kind of went through the similar thing. It becomes hard to recruit people to work in state government. Last comment to you, Ben.
Representative Brian, the clock's got us, but doing some quick political math here, I've noted you are a 2-term representative. You are up for re-election next year. State Auditor Gallion is also a 2-term state auditor up for re-election next year. Would this ever be something that you would consider running for statewide? Have you heard of any other Republicans looking to run for this position, given his comments on the legislature that you serve in very publicly last session?
Good question, Ben. Good question. Yeah.
No, I do not have any aspirations to run for the state auditor. I do not have an accounting background. I'm not a CPA. I can do basic books for our business and do those checks and balances. I'm good at digging into stuff and organizing in the details, but do not have any aspirations. I we'll see if I'll run again. I still have some time to decide that, but
Emily, you're a serious person. I appreciate you entertaining my crass political questions, but we are also a North Dakota politics show. So what I'm taking from your answer is that you're considering running for governor since Doug Burgum is running for president. And we'll just leave it there. You have a good night. No, I'm just kidding.
Oh my gosh. All right. On that note, we're going to end the interview. Thanks for taking us completely off the rails, Ben.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you, Emily.
Hi there, my name is James Wallner. I produce and host the podcast Dakota Spotlight, a true crime podcast that tackles historical and unsolved crimes in the upper Midwest. Follow along with me as we search for a missing girl, attempt to solve a 45-year-old murder, and much, much more. That's Dakota Spotlight Podcast, anywhere you get your podcasts, or at inforum.com/podcasts.
Well, just wrapped up our interview with Representative Emily O'Brien. That's certainly a situation to watch in the Lafferty Committee as that unfolds. But now we're going to switch gears here, and we're going to talk about taxes. And who better to have on to talk about taxes than the tax commissioner, Brian Kroshus, who's a Republican. And by the way, Brian, I brought you on to talk about property taxes because there's a ballot measure. We're going to have the property tax debate again. They're going to be collecting signatures. At this point, I think just about anybody who wants to put an issue on a ballot can. Our signature gathering process is porous, but that's a topic for another show. I expect this issue to be on the ballot. I expect us to have another debate about eliminating property taxes. I know that North Dakotans are perpetually upset about their property taxes. But before we get to any of that, let's talk about the sales tax, because your office put out some sales tax figures today that were pretty interesting. Saw some pretty big increases. Can you summarize that for us?
Yes, we experienced the 8th consecutive quarter of growth in terms of collections. The North Dakota economy has not only gotten back to pre-pandemic levels, but it's surpassed those totals now. And as compared to 3-4 years ago, we're performing well. It's a cyclical economy in North Dakota because of oil and gas, because of ag commodities, and just commodity pricing in general. So good to see. There's a bit of an inflation factor built into these numbers as well, just the cost of goods, et cetera. They are running higher than they would have under normal circumstances. Again, inflation does have somewhat of a role, but most of the growth is being driven by just a very solid economy in the state right now, and employment figures, numbers are up. That helps as well, and things are looking good at least through the first quarter of this calendar year, which was January through March. And we report out about now on those figures because once we hit the end of a quarter, March 31st, for example, then what happens? Businesses and other entities have to begin sending their returns in. We process them, begin recording them. They have a month to report, and then we have about 4 or 5 weeks to total the results and then provide figures to the public.
So a thing I always like to remind people when we talk about taxes and revenues and budgets in North Dakota is that our state government, unless they're spending directly out of a special fund, although sometimes not even then, a lot of times what they're spending are forecasted revenues. There's not like a checking account that's got, the however many billions of dollars that the legislature appropriates sitting in it, and then we just write checks out of that fund. It's a constant where money's coming in and then money's going out. And so when the lawmakers budget, they're budgeting based on a forecast, based on tax revenues we're expected to take in. And most of the time they do a pretty good job. But what always scares me when we talk about tax revenues over the last, 15 years now, I suppose, is how much of it is based on a commodity-driven economy and how quickly, as we certainly saw towards the end of Governor Dalrymple's administration, how quickly things can change. For instance, if the bottom falls out of the oil markets, it's a little scary how dependent we are sometimes. As much as I love our energy industry and love our agriculture industry, and this is really a question about North Dakota's diversified economy, but sometimes, Brian, it really scares me how dependent we are on those industries.
We're very dependent on the oil and gas side of the equation. Lawmakers limit how much of those dollars or how many of those dollars can go into the general fund. It's $200 million per year or $400 million per biennium. And when you're looking at collections in the $2.5 billion, this year they'll approach $3 billion mark. That in itself isn't where the concern lies, but to your point, the associated revenue, because of activity in the energy industry, oil and gas, as mentioned, but also on the agricultural side, that leads to more purchases occurring throughout the state. Those purchases generate revenue through sales tax. And that associated revenue is where we experience a shortfall when there's a slowdown. And that did happen, as you mentioned, in the 2015-2017 biennium, I believe. And we went from looking really good just a few years earlier to being in a budget shortfall situation. So it has to be monitored, it has to be watched very closely. And with a record-setting budget, even though quite a bit of that is on the federal side in terms of the growth, we still have to be cognizant that it's cyclical. Things go up, things go down. They're looking good today, but if we experience a slowdown, the next biennium could become more interesting as we move forward.
And I guess eventually I'll let Ben answer the question here, but I wanted to segue from there because that's kind of where I wanted to go was, there's always the three-legged stool is a metaphor that's often used for revenues in North Dakota. And
Brian's never heard that one.
Brian's never heard that one before. And property taxes are obviously one leg of the stool. Listen, I don't like my property tax bill as much as the next person. I get it. I understand why people are upset. But one thing that worries me a little bit is where's the revenue going to come from to replace it? So talk a little bit about that, about what it would be like to balance North Dakota's checkbook if suddenly we didn't have the property tax anymore as a revenue source, mostly for local government, and suddenly the state government was obliged to replace that revenue for locals. How does that work? How do we balance the books, Brian, from your perspective?
Well, in terms of the property tax measure, they're looking at legacy fund earnings, so dollars that have already been set aside and will continue to be set aside in the future, and then taking the earnings. That's my understanding of the measure when I read the language. So it wouldn't be reliant on the day-to-day collections, but rather the earnings from the legacy fund. But that in itself generates a number of questions as well. If those dollars are earmarked and they're maxed out in terms of what's being earned to satisfy property tax obligations or a replacement for those revenue, for that revenue that the cities, counties, the political subdivisions rely on, that's something that has to be carefully vetted. It's a big decision that voters will be making that will where dollars might otherwise be spent from, again, those earnings from the legacy fund. So I think in terms of balancing the state budget, that mechanism really resides with lawmakers, the number they set in terms of overall spending. Are they adjusting accordingly for the ups and downs of the market, the commodity-driven market that we talked about? And but it's in the early stages in terms of that measure. I agree. I think they will get the signatures necessary to put it on the ballot, but there will be a lot of conversation without question going forward from both proponents and opponents of the measure. And it's similar to the conversation that occurred even dating back to 2012 when this was talked about, as well as 2020, which was influenced in terms of the impact of COVID and how that really didn't get off the ground in terms of signature gathering. But I think we'll see it on the ballot this next time around. But if we were a budget shortfall, there is a tie back to those earnings. That backstop, even though we have the budget stabilization fund and some other mechanisms, rainy day funds, if you want to call it that, if it's earmarked for one specific purpose and it's collected in one area to satisfy an obligation in another, those dollars are still gone. They can't be used for anything else. And I don't know that there would be a lot left over without tapping into the principal. And that in itself is not what was intended when the legacy fund was established in terms of taking principal dollars back out. It's meant to be a substitute down the road if oil and gas, for example, isn't as prominent in terms of activity, revenue generation in the state.
Brian, going back to the forecasting process, I've long thought, and admittedly it's my axe to grind. I will cop to before I ask this question, but I think it is one of the great unsung aspects of how North Dakota state government goes about its business, that in addition to having legislative session and therefore only being able to set the budget, only having the option to set the budget every other year, North Dakota as a government relies on these budget forecasts. For instance, the last one was actually closer to this legislative session than normal because we had a special session for redistricting, meaning we didn't have 2021 predictions, early 2021 predictions throughout. We had fall 2021 predictions. Now, looking at the numbers, and it's an audio format, I happen to have some text numbers up on a PDF. You're able to see the screen. But as I'm reading them, you've collected about $130 million more than was planned on. Sales and personal income taxes are up. Corporate income tax collection is 16% higher than was predicted back in the fall of the 2021 session. As a tax commissioner who oversees this, do you see any problems with this lack of precision in forecasting? Have you spoken to the legislators about adjusting this? I know there was some work done in appropriations a few years ago to look at this forecasting, but do you have any thoughts on this or anything, or even if you disagree with me, any context to add for listeners who are wondering how the budget process goes about its business?
Sure. In terms of revenue forecasting, that goes through OMB, the Office of Management and Budget, in coordination with lawmakers, leadership in particular. The governor's office is also involved because that is a cabinet agency. And I think the word of caution when we're budgeting as a state and forecasting to make sure that we have enough money to fund the priorities and the budget that is approved by lawmakers each session, it's really important that we take a conservative approach to those numbers. And if we are in fact doing that and taking a conservative approach, then we will see these types of overages, positive numbers above and beyond the forecast. But at the same time, what goes up can go down. And it can certainly work the other way as well, that if we're in a shortfall situation where we're 16% down instead of 16% up, that creates problems.
I would say I was going to maybe devil's advocate you a little bit and push back and say I don't think the predictions have only ever gone up. I think, in fact, several times they've had shortfalls. And again, a level of imprecision that I think makes budgeting a little bit sloppier. Is that it? Have you advocated one way or another as a tax commissioner to maybe have forecasts at least that are maybe a little bit more up to date? It would seem when we're looking at things to the tune of hundreds of millions being off, that another forecast couldn't be cost prohibitive to do.
There are ongoing conversations with Moody's and other analysts that the state enlists for help in terms of advocating to get to your question itself. I've always been an advocate for being conservative in terms of how we forecast. But forecasting is one component. We can look at the inbound revenues, but really what type of liability are we creating when these budgets are constructed? And the overall number is determined, I believe this past biennium, it's in the $18.4 billion around that mark. And that's a big number. Even with the federal funds, it's still a robust number. And we did see not that many years ago how quickly it turned. And this is just a few years back. And we heard it in political campaigns about balancing the budget deficit was talked about $1 billion plus in terms of that deficit. We drained all of the rainy day funds. They were gone just to get through that cycle. So they've been rebuilt, they've been replenished, but I think the word of caution is we need to be very conservative in terms of looking at these forecasts. They are toned down. Oil isn't projected to be $90 or $100 when the budgeting occurs. It's taken down quite a bit, but we're also very reliant on some external sources and hoping that they're accurate in their predictions as well. And sometimes they're accurate. Oftentimes they are, but we've seen instances where they weren't. And again, it goes back to just how quickly things can turn.
And there can also be instances where we're just not sure. I mean, I don't know. I mean, if I could forecast everything the oil industry is going to do, I probably wouldn't be a podcaster. I'd be a billionaire somewhere. It's some of it's just unpredictable, which is just built into it, commodity prices or what have you. I wonder. I think there's this unpredictability, and because North Dakota is such a commodity based, and this is more of a philosophical point, I guess. I've always felt that taxation should apply to a prod base and be relatively low, which I guess in my mind, the government belongs to all of us. We should all have some degree of responsibility to pay for it. So taxes should be broad and low. I mean, that's my preference. And so I worry in a state like ours that is so dependent on oil revenues, so dependent on crop prices, about narrowing our tax base, because that's what we're doing. We're eliminating a tax. We're putting more spending obligation on state level revenues. So that's income tax, sales tax, etc. And we're going to create a situation where we have a lot less flexibility when if we run into some of these economic headwinds. Things look great in North Dakota right now, and it's maybe easy to make a decision in this environment to say, oh yeah, let's get rid of the property tax. I worry about what happens when things get tough. Are those concerns founded in your mind, Brian?
Absolutely. There's no doubt about it. And we have more than just those two industry sectors, two business sectors in the state, but they are by far the largest revenue drivers overall. And again, the associated revenue that we receive from those industries or as a result of that activity. But it underscores the importance of diversifying our economy and continually looking for ways to produce more different types of goods and services in the state, attract new business that would be outside of those two primary sectors, even though we can always experience and welcome growth from them. But the more we can diversify our economy, the more stable the overall revenue picture looks over the course of time. But even new sectors, whether it's technology, these other components that are out there, they still have ups and downs as well. And it's beyond our borders in terms of things that influence the marketplace. We're talking about the country as a whole. We're talking about a global economy. We're an exporter, not just to other states when it comes to our energy products, for example, or agricultural products, but we move these goods worldwide, particularly on the ag side. So it's about finding new markets. It's about diversifying our economy and having a good environment where businesses want to operate in our state. So that's important. I believe a low tax environment promotes, not inhibits growth, because it, again, attracts new industry, new businesses. And I think that's a positive whenever we can expand our business base. There's no question about it.
Brian, there's going to be that push to eliminate property taxes next year, being led by Rick Becker. There are other former and current state legislators, all of whom are in your political party as well, who are going to be pushing for this. The social media posts I have seen so far promoting this have touted that not enough has been done to reduce property tax burden on on homeowners in the state of North Dakota. There is some narrative, and admittedly, this is anecdotal on my part, that this could all be covered using the legacy fund earnings or quote other slush funds that I've seen. When I think property taxes as a former legislator, I mostly think funding schools. And that is something that is already heavily subsidized by the Common Schools Trust Fund. I know I'm going down a rabbit hole, but brass tacks for the taxpayer at home, the Common Schools Trust Fund couldn't be used to shore up anything that is offset or that would be taken away from the K through 12 budget for the entire state of North Dakota. Only the legacy fund earnings could do that. The way I'm looking at it, you'd have to spend, the legislature would have to spend 28% of the fund's value in order to make up for those costs in one biennium, or you'd have to raise a bunch of other taxes, which I'm guessing they don't have an appetite for. I personally think they want to do that and then make drastic cuts everywhere else and not make up for those things. Do you find my math to be correct there in the context for that? Do you think these can be made up? Do you think property taxes could be made up for using the legacy fund or the slush fund, or do you disagree? Other funds that they refer to as slush funds, or do you disagree with that narrative?
It depends on what inputs you use in terms of the return on that investment, the legacy fund dollars. If you're talking about a 5%, for example, return on those funds, market returns, it has to average that. It would be very close. This past, I believe it was in 2021, taxes paid in 2022 on property tax. In the property tax arena, that was approximately $1.4 billion. That's the obligation as of 2022 collections. If we fast forward a decade from now, 15 years from now, that number could be in the $3 billion range. So when you're looking at a principal amount in the legacy fund of what does that have to be? What does the math look like? And that has to be carefully vetted, whether or not it can cover that obligation, or if it would have to come from other areas as well. The one thing that people have to be cognizant of, if that were approved, and I think conceptually on the surface, people like the sound of it, and it really doesn't eliminate the property tax obligation. It just really shifts how it's identified.
You're talking about the ballot measure right now.
Correct. That funding is still needed at the local level for schools, emergency services, infrastructure, maintenance and repair, enhancements, et cetera. So those dollars are still needed. And what we're talking about really is where does the funding come from? Now it comes from homeowners, property owners, and that would shift to industry. And in particular, oil and gas, since that's where the legacy fund dollars are generated from. So it's a big shift in terms of where the funding comes from. And it will limit, there's no question, it would limit other options in terms of what those dollars might be used for, and would tighten things up quite a bit. So those are questions that I think are fair to ask, and we should have answers for. And both sides, opponents and proponents, are going to be lobbying both ways on it. Yeah.
So you come down on a it depends. You're not ready to confirm that yet, but you're not saying no.
I think it's early to. I really want to run the numbers and see how realistic it is on the funding mechanism that's being proposed. I will say this, it's a big decision. It's going to take a big bite out of the apple in terms of the projected earnings, and it may limit, well, without question, if it passes, it wouldn't be a may, it would limit how those dollars might be repurposed otherwise. And was that the original intent of the legacy fund to begin with? Some will argue, yes, it's the perfect avenue and mechanism to put in place. Others will have some consternation and concern. But the one thing that in this whole conversation, when you look at property tax obligations by owners of homes, land, commercial property,
buildings,
etc., right. When you're looking at what they're taxed at currently, that's driven by political subdivisions and what they determine to be their budget number for the year or the biennium, every 2 years. Local government decides what they're going to spend. Then the values are an input, but really the mill rate is driven by what is the budget, what is the overall spend going to be for a city, for a township, for a county. That's where the mill rate is generated from. The valuation of a piece of property will certainly influence taxes paid, but it really begins with the budget number. And I think a lot of times that isn't talked about enough. That's where all of this originates. That's where the consternation really is created in terms of what property tax bills look like.
There's I always when people lay off the blame for higher property taxes on valuations, I always like to point out, listen, they control the mill levy rate. Like you can change the mill levies. If the valuations are going up, property taxes don't automatically have to go up. They could change the rate at which the value is taxed in order to keep property tax in line if they want to. I think the problem is they don't want to, which leads into my one thing that really concerns me about this too is there's always an interplay between taxing and spending. And so the legislature, for instance, if they want to have more money to spend, they have to find it from somewhere. And that might mean raising a tax, although that hasn't happened in a long time. It could mean raising a fee or raising a tax. They have to get the revenue from somewhere. And so what worries me is if we say, well, the legacy fund can just replace the property tax. Well, what happens if property tax needs go beyond what the legacy fund produces in revenues. So what if we see a massive population explosion in a part of the state, and suddenly the counties there and the cities there and the park districts and everybody else who collects from the property tax, suddenly they need more revenue. Well, just because we've had a population explosion, unlike, if you have a population explosion, then you can kind of count on, okay, well, we're going to have some more sales tax, or we're going to have some more property tax because more people are living and they're building homes, they're doing all the stuff that generates tax revenues. We don't necessarily get more legacy fund revenue because we have more people in the state. So, I mean, I feel like we're kind of unshackling, we're obligating the legacy fund to pay for something, for costs that are driven by factors that are completely divorced from the legacy fund. And we're also allowing local elected officials to spend money that they're not obligated to tax for, right? Because that's the other thing. It's like, well, we'd really like to build, on the park district. Well, we'd really like to build this giant water park or something, but the taxpayers are going to say no to a property tax increase. That interplay, I think, is important. I feel like we're getting completely away from that, where we're going to use a revenue source that has no real basis on spending needs to pay for to provide revenue for spending made by people who aren't obligated to tax for it. I worry about that. And again, that's kind of a philosophical question, but I think that's an important part of this debate, Brian. Am I off my rocker here?
I think it's a legitimate question, and I think it's one that has to be answered. And if it can't be answered specifically, it has to be taken into consideration, because if there are budget shortfalls, revenue shortfalls at the county level, for example, or within a political subdivision of any kind, then if they don't have enough in terms of what is inbound through legacy fund earnings, what's allocated to them, will they be looking at increasing their local sales tax figure? The state tax is at 5%. That's the sales tax rate. And for most things, alcohol purchases would be a bit higher at 7%, et cetera. But, for most goods and services, it's a 5% sales tax rate is what we apply. But then there's also a county tax. That might be 0.5%. There's a city sales tax. That might be 1%. It might be 1.5%. So in aggregate, we see a lot of 6.5%, 7% tax rates in the state. Overall, in terms of what you see on your receipt when you make a purchase, you'll see a 6.5%, 7% sales tax, 5% is the state. Will that cause those local political subdivisions to then raise their local sales tax to try and make up for a shortfall if there isn't enough money coming from the legislature or through this funding mechanism that's being proposed, I should say, by the special measures? So, no, it's a fair question. This has to be carefully vetted. And voters need to be informed, okay, what exactly does this mean? It sounds good on the surface, but what are the pros? What are the cons? Positives, negatives, as we go through this particular process, and conversation will invariably continue. There's going to be a tremendous amount of conversation and dialogue surrounding this.
Brian, it's a thoughtful answer. I would like to point out you did miss your opportunity to tell Rob that he was off his rocker, and we're going to need you to be a little faster about that in the future. But I want to go back to something you mentioned before, which is the 3 categories, and throw a little philosophy at you, where we've taken up a good portion of your time now. But you had mentioned the differences between ag or land property taxes, industrial or commercial property taxes, and then, of course, personal property for usually single-family homes, your main dwelling. I think the main heartburn folks in North Dakota, and probably generally people have around property taxes, are, unlike income where you're earning income, unlike sales tax where you are choosing to make a purchase, property taxes exist whether you own a house or not, whether you're taking care of it well or not, and they exist for folks who are on fixed income or retired, so on and so forth. You're a tax commissioner. I know you're well aware of this argument, but let me throw something out at you. I feel like when folks like Rick Becker come at voters with we're just going to eliminate all the property taxes, do it overnight, I feel like the heartburn coming from policymakers tends to be, and I think correctly so, that you might be throwing out the baby with the bathwater. Can you break down for taxpayers and listeners here, what roughly are the numbers or percentages off the top of your head of property tax collection between those three categories: agricultural, commercial, and residential? And could it be some kind of a compromise that, say, the ballot measure eliminates residential for, property taxes for primary residences and keeps it for the rest, and we try and make up for it from there? What would your response to that be?
I'd have to look at the specific numbers in terms of the three categories. I'm actually flipping through my book right now to get the some accurate numbers for you. Could it be just one segment? It's certainly possible, but it depends on what the language looks like on the measure, and it has been presented as an overarching property tax relief type proposal. So,
I mean, the measure is what it is at this point. They've submitted it for approval for circulation. So, I mean, there's no.
But for all property taxes, say someone proposed that, though, because they have a differentiate, give it nuance, and I think it would not. I don't think it would directly address the heartburn people are getting, because in theory, agricultural land is being farmed and therefore earning income. Again, not always the case. Just roll with me. Commercial land is supposed to have for-profit businesses that are paying rent on there, generating income. Your home that you live in, and your two older retirees that aren't earning income, or three, or however many, doesn't matter. That's where the heartburn is. They're essentially paying a North Dakota mortgage. My friends in Texas call it a Texas mortgage because their property taxes are so sky high, and I fear we're becoming that here.
Well, there's no doubt that people aren't happy about their property tax and numbers. And while valuations have increased, and oftentimes it's presented that there's a direct correlation, and there is to some extent. But again, it goes back to what is local government deciding to spend, and what's their budget number overall. One thing that's interesting when we talk about home ownership in the state, and that's another component of this. 4 out of 10 North Dakotans do not own a home; they rent. We have,
and it's higher in places like Fargo. Sorry to interrupt.
Right. No, you're correct. We have one of the highest rental rates in terms of people living in North Dakota in the state. One of the higher rental percentages in the nation, and I believe we are the 4th lowest in terms of home ownership. And a part of that is when you look at the university system, you look at NDSU, you look at UND.
Those aren't supposed to be homeowners at that stage in their life. That makes sense.
Yeah,
but I have felt for a long time the percentage of renters versus homeowners has diminished the sense of community in a large part of the population. I mean, that's very much me talking to someone who lives in Fargo, and that is an opinion, not a fact. But
I think we need to probably end the interview there. But I do think that. It's going to be an interesting debate, and a lot of it gets back. I mean, what I've been saying for years is, if you're upset about your property taxes, talk to the people that levy them. It seems like we're constantly trying to implement a statewide solution, whether it's through the legislature or now the ballot box, for what's really a local issue. But that seems to fall on deaf ears. Brian, thank you so much for your time. I appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you, Rob, and good visiting with you, Ben, as well.
Hi, everybody. I'm Chad Kuhl, host of the Northland Outdoors Podcast. Hey, here in the Northland, we love our time outside. And on the Northland Outdoors Podcast, we're going to talk about all of it. Not just fishing, not just hunting, but mountain biking, camping, rock climbing, bird watching, you name it. We're going to have it on the Northland Outdoors Podcast. New episodes every 2 weeks on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, wherever you get your podcasts. So look for it and join us on the Northland Outdoors Podcast.
All right, just finished up our interview with Tax Commissioner Brian Kroshus, and that's going to be an interesting property tax debate. Now, I mean, clearly, in 2012, I should note, I was for eliminating the property tax. I was very much writing for it. I have had a change of heart on that, and so of course, Port, you're a liberal now, which is not true. But the thing I struggle with, because again, I pay the property tax too. I'm not real keen on it. I think it's way too high.
And the fun amount the double digits, it's gone up in the last 2 years.
It's gone up ridiculously.
It's insane in my neck of the woods too.
But the thing that I struggle with is, what do we replace it with? And I'm not sure that the legacy fund is a good answer, because again, the legacy fund's earnings, the amount of revenue that it kicks off, and you got to remember how the legacy fund works. It gets deposits from oil tax revenues, and those deposits may go up or down depending on oil taxes, but then the revenue it produces from how those billions in principal are invested is its own revenue source. And the thing I worry about is that revenue, so the legacy fund is a source of revenue, its investments and its returns as a source of revenue are not tied to what drives needs for state spending, such as population increases, such as natural disasters, all the other things that can happen that can impact local budgets. And so I think I think what would happen is if we replace local property taxes with the legacy fund, what you're going to see happen is local spending is going to outstrip eventually what the legacy fund can produce. And then everybody's going to go looking for more revenue. So that's going to mean tax increases perhaps at the state level, or if the locals aren't liking what they're getting from the state, to Brian's point, you're going to see upward pressure on something like a local sales tax, where suddenly local sales taxes are going up.
We are already out of the norm high on sales tax in the state. People don't realize that. I mean, I am sorry.
Maybe then
I had to tell this to my Republican friends a lot, but the air goes out of the balloon somewhere. Our property tax, it's not a debate. If you live in my neck of the woods, if you want to avoid property taxes, you buy on the Minnesota side of the river. I mean, you will pay tens of thousands of dollars less depending on the property. Now, your income tax is going to be different, but sometimes if you do the math, it doesn't add out. And the sales tax here is exorbitantly high. It's at 7%. Every purchase now has 7% being taken out of you. If you buy a dollar stick of gum, 7 cents goes to the city of West Fargo. Come on.
2 cents, 5 cents goes to the state. 2 cents.
Yes, correct. But it's still very high. And here's the breakdown though for the political reality. I fully support your mission on this podcast, and clearly I'm here every week breaking down the nuance and the details behind these things. Very clearly what's going to happen is if we have messaging like this on the quote unquote two sides, and I don't think Brian was trying to take a side against or for, but if you have folks coming out and saying, well, if we get rid of property taxes, we're going to have to access the legacy fund. And when you access the legacy fund, here's the other upward pressure of the sales tax, blah, 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 blah. And it's just going to sound like Charlie Brown's parents to voters in the last 2 weeks of the election. And then you're going to have Rick Becker and others coming out saying, your property taxes are too damn high. Vote for this and we'll eliminate property taxes. 2 sentences. Boom, it's done.
Yeah.
I think that increases the chances of that passing despite it not passing.
Sure.
And I really did want to hear from Brian. What is the difference between those three categories? Because it really does matter. Property taxes on commercial land versus ag land versus primary owned residential are totally different. If the other two are in any way somewhat sustaining of the things they fund right now, and these aren't fluff things, K through 12 education, roads and infrastructure, then let's potentially take, I would say that'd be a thing to take a look at as an alternative instead of what I'm seeing as throwing the baby out with the bathwater, which is what
if you're upset about property, there's some things you could do to broaden the property tax base. We have a lot of exemptions from property taxes. We could look at some of those. You broaden the base, hopefully you bring down the rates. But the problem again is what's driving a lot of this.
Those interests will come in hot and heavy, but you're not wrong.
They're political non-starters. Like if you want to start, you want to start looping in like the tax exemption, that some of the ag folks get. That's a political non-starter. We're not going to do it. But if you want to look at an effective way to lower property taxes, that's one way, is to broaden the base. The problem is we've created this. We kind of committed an original sin, and it was back in the early days of my political writing career, where the locals successfully blamed the state for high property taxes, and the state obliged them by trying to do something about it instead of telling them, no, this is your problem. You tax, you spend, you figure it out. The locals have successfully won that debate to the point where
I will say the locals have had to navigate. I actually have a little bit of sympathy here, where they were given the soft mandate by the legislature of saying you must have blank, blank, and blank, K through 12, this many roads, whatever, Oh, and by the way, why don't you figure out how to pay for it? We're gonna give you that. We're gonna give you that mandate or that expectation, and you figure it out.
Well, what's the alternative, though? I mean, what's the alternative? Is all the decisions for school spending and
Fund it.
everything get made in Bismarck?
Start bonding with the DOT, and I'm
Sure.
glad for the direction that Jack Dalrymple moved in, that Governor Burgum kept, which was increasing the state's
Sure.
obligation to K through 12, and then make K through 12 budgeting more precise. Don't base it on last year's.
Right.
Base it on how many students are going to be there. It's all the silver bullet solution is bad because it's almost never a solution. The solution is believing in being an elected, having public sector folks who actually believe in their work and getting it's never going to be complete, but you're going to need to get it done every year. And that goes to my point about the poor forecasting as well in the every other year session. You got to modernize government and make it more reactive and make it more interactive with what is actually going on versus, I hope this is the case in 20 months from now.
Yeah, but part of the problem is nobody wants to take responsibility for this. Everybody wants to pretend it's somebody else's problem. Somebody else is creating the problem. And that's where we get to this, where the property tax issue has become intractable. The buy downs the legislature has done have accomplished nothing, which we saw during the last legislative session. There was an alternative to the income tax cut, which was another property tax buy down. And Governor Burgum flat out came and said, I'm not supporting that. And he was right to, because they don't, all it's done is accumulate more local spending in the state budget. And so, I mean, there's a thing where North Dakotans, we want local control and we want local budget decisions made in our communities, but we don't like our property taxes, but we don't want to end any property tax exemptions to broaden the property. Something's got to give. And the problem is, if we keep it intractable, what's going to happen is we're just going to blow up the whole system with the property tax measure. And that, and maybe immediately in the first 5 years or 10 years, that'll be fine. But then down the road, I guarantee you, there's going to be pressure to create a local income tax. There's going to be a pressure because the legacy fund's not going to be able to keep up with it. And then we're going to have squandered the legacy of the legacy fund on tax reform that pays short-term benefits. I think it's a terrible idea.
I was against it. I was against it back in 2004 because I thought, again, it was throwing out the baby with the bathwater. I'm now almost wrapped around a tish with the idea. I don't know what the numbers are. I was legitimately asking Brian what those were. And I did want to hear more details and more concrete analysis from him. And I don't like criticizing someone after interviewing them. They're not here to respond to it. But I think that when this subject is going to come before all North Dakota voters and all North Dakota voters who care about their state, which in theory they all do, well, who you go to when you want some information about tax collection? We have every state has a tax commissioner. For instance, the state of Minnesota doesn't have a tax commissioner. I don't think South Dakota has a elected tax commissioner. We need information from someone like that, and very frankly, to take a little bit more of an activist role when something that's directly impacting taxes that voters are going to vote on. They need to know what the true ramifications are, because very frankly, I think the list of ballot initiative sponsors right now, I don't think they're going to give you the nuanced detail. They're just going to say more freedom.
I would argue, and this is another diatribe from Rob against the whole ballot measure process. I would argue we very rarely get nuance in these ballot measure debates because political slogans win. Nuanced arguments do not. They're at a I shouldn't say they never win, but they're at a disadvantage. If you could put your slogan on a bumper sticker, that's an advantage over people who have to sit down and explain, hey, long term, this is not a good decision for the state of North Dakota.
So I think it's the responsibility of legislators and someone like a tax commissioner, and I would actually say Governor Burgum too, because he is the governor.
Well, let's also remember we're very early on in this process. They don't even have the measure approved for circulation yet. The signatures aren't even due until February. If they want to make the June primary ballot until February, April at the latest next year. We have a lot of time for that information. I'm not going to jump on Brian Kroshus for not having it all at. We invited him on to talk about this, so I don't. We have time to get this information. This information needs to be out there, and I agree with you. We do need it soon because I don't want false narratives to develop. If North Dakotans are going to make this decision, it needs to be an informed decision. and we got to get that information out there sooner rather than later before some of the slogans take root.
We are early on, but narratives take place and form and calcify very quickly. And if you don't have an alternative to this, it feels like a problem to most North Dakotans.
Yeah.
And people like Rick Becker are offering what he is calling a solution. And if you respond with,
he's offering snake oil, but the problem is arguing against it kind of sounds like you're arguing in favor of the status quo, which I am not. I don't like the status quo either. The problem is I don't want to solve it with something that's worse. And I think that's where this debate is certainly going to be going on quite a bit. I think we'll put a pin in it there for now. Ben, thank you so much as always, and we'll talk again. Did you know Forum Communications Company has a robust podcast library? At inforum.com/podcasts, we have everything from politics, sports, true crime, outdoor adventure, and more. Visit inforum.com/podcasts and explore them all today.